I want to thank Tyndale Seminary for allowing me to come and do these lectures. I'm speaking more and more in the topics involving anti-Semitism around the country as I have opportunity. And so I'm happy to be doing this, and I hope it's of some benefit and value to you in your personal lives and ministry. This particular session, which is the next segment number 7, is modern Zionism and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, notice how I did the title. Modern Zionism. Okay, Zionism is the belief that Israel, the Jewish people, have a right to the land, now and in the future. And then the Arab-Israeli conflict. Notice how I did not say that. I did not say the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So I'm rebelling against the way it is normally talked about in recent times. So, but we'll have some more to say about that. Picture of Ben Gurion under a picture of Theodore Herzl, the father of modern Israel. Unfortunately, he died somewhere around 1905, I think. So he did not live to see the fruition of a lot of his focus. He wrote 2 books I know of, 1896, The Jewish State, Herzl, I mean. And then in 1903, I think, The Old New Land, where he kind of wrote a novel. It was in form of a novel. He was a journalist by trade, and so he wrote a novel kind of expressing in 1920, if Israel was a nation in the land, what it would look like. So it'd be worth, if you ever have some free time, go read that. And he was a bit naive about the Arabs accepting Jewish control and Jewish heavy presence in the land. But it's an interesting read, and his vision for what Israel would be. I'm going to start in this segment, modern pogroms. Remember I said the first major pogrom was the First Crusade? Okay, pogrom, what does that word mean? It refers to attacks upon the Jews, especially in the late 1800s, early 1900s. These are actually ginned up riots against the Jews. Attacks are mostly in Europe, especially Russia and the Middle East, although we'll see a couple of places outside of that as we go along. I'm going to start with pogroms inside Russia. And the context is of the Pale of Settlement in 1791, where basically Russia, who controlled a big chunk of Eastern Europe at the time, said you cannot go outside of this territory. So the Jews were confined, and it was referred to as the Pale of Settlement. In 1821, you have anti-Jewish riots in Odessa, which is in Ukraine. 1881 to 1884, waves of pogroms in Kiev, Warsaw, and Odessa. Kiev and Odessa are in Ukraine today. Warsaw, of course, is in Poland today. 1903 to 1905, major breakout in Odessa, 2,500 Jews killed in 1905, and on and on. Ukraine has a sordid history, and of course Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union and controlled by Russia for much of its history. Outside of Russia, over 30 pogroms in the 1800s. Some pogroms lasted for a few years. So every time a Jew living in the area got up in the morning, he would wonder if that was his last day, or if his business was going to be destroyed. It was just a hard time. Baghdad, 1828, that's in today what is Iraq. Then it was just in the Ottoman Empire. Damascus Affair, 1840, in what is today Syria. We saw that before as a major place for blood libel, and their claims to agree with it. There's Wales, 1911. That's not exactly Russia in the Middle East, is it? And then there's Argentina, 1919. That's not exactly in Russia or the Middle East either. So, been plenty of those. And you saw the movie, the name just went right out of my head, from the late 1800s, the movie about, what's that? Fiddler on the Roof, thank you. I had a senior moment. Fiddler on the Roof, you saw the movie, okay, and the struggles, the family struggles and those things. But to bring it up to full scope, Crystal Night, the Night of the Broken Glass, where you have in Nazi Germany and in Austria, November 9 and 10, 1938. The trigger was an assassination of a German diplomat by a Jew. At least that's the claim. And as a result of that, Hitler leads the SS guys and others to ratchet up the mobs to go and pillage, and they pillaged 1,668 synagogues in those 2 days. 267 set on fire, 95 in Vienna alone. Close to 100 people killed on those 2 days. Talk about Jewish people. Now, the response of that to the Friends of Israel I mentioned before, I want to say it again. Friends of Israel started in response to this. Started as a relief organization. We met in December of 1938. Louis Berry Schaefer was part of that. Harry Ironside was part of that. And many businessmen in the Philadelphia area, they met to try to set up a refugee organization to get the Jews out of Germany. Now, the results of this anti-Semitism, all these pogroms, especially the ones leading up to the 1880s, and we see beginning late 1800s, a massive migration of Jews to the United States, mostly in New York City. And these were not rich people. They were poor Jews. And there were waves of Christian ministries who were doing things for the Jewish people coming into the land. Arno C. Gablein was one of them. He was a Methodist missionary working with Jewish immigrants in New York City. And he was self-taught in languages. He self-taught himself Hebrew. And I don't mean just reading the Hebrew Bible. I mean speaking Hebrew. And he put up a sign as all these immigrants coming in, and he's giving them bread out and helping them with food and clothing and things like that. He put a sign up, rented a hall, put a sign up, come hear what a Gentile thinks about the promises to David. And he filled up the hall. And in the middle of his message, a rabbi stood up and said, "You're a liar. You're not a Gentile. No Gentile could speak Hebrew that well." But they were poor Jews. There's migration of Jews also to Palestine that dramatically increases. And then you have the rise of the modern Zionist movement. And that's the Jewish question. What to do with the Jews? We know Hitler had his answer to the Jewish question. But the Jews had their own question. They said, what do we do about us? We're being attacked over and over and over again. Now, so we've got to figure it out, and the solution to the movement of modern Zionism is we need a national homeland. And Zionism is the belief that Israel has the right to a national land, usually in Palestine, because there have been other alternatives given. And it's an effort to get European governments to support this effort. Herzl would visit with the governments and the leaders, various leaders of the various countries, and he would say, I would like to take the Jews off your hands. Will you support me having a nation, getting a nation going for the Jews in Palestine or Uganda or wherever, and let us go, and you won't have to deal with it anymore. That was the tactic that was taken, and the thought was, if we had our national homeland, anti-Semitism would stop. Well, they have a national homeland now. Has anti-Semitism stopped? No, it hasn't. That, their expectation did not come to pass. They do have a nation which can defend at least some of the Jews in the world, and does it quite well, as we've seen. Okay. There's Theodor Herzl. Once again, he was a reporter for a newspaper in Vienna. And in 1894, he was on assignment in Paris, France, to cover the Dreyfus trial, the Dreyfus affair, where an officer was accused of treason. Now, he was a Jewish officer, and he was accused of treason. Now, it was a setup. He was not guilty, but it was a setup. And what Theodor Herzl saw were the French mobs gathered outside the courtyard yelling at the top of their lungs, "Kill the Jews!" And he witnessed that. The mobs crying out to kill not just Dreyfus, but to kill the Jews. And it took him aback, and he wrote in 1896 the book, The Jewish State, where he proposes having a national homeland for the Jewish people, preferably in Palestine. But he would have taken somewhere else just to have a place where they could defend themselves for temporarily. But I think he always visualized going back to Israel. So the only solution to that anti-Semitism in Europe is for the Jews to have their own nation. Out of that, he started the first Zionist Congress. There's a picture of it. I don't think it was taken with an iPhone camera. That's the first Zionist Congress, Basel, Switzerland, 1897. And Herzl is standing there, right there. And so he begins this movement, and they meet just about every year, every other year. And he makes this note in his diary. He says, after the conference, at Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be answered by universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years, certainly in 50, everyone will know it. Now, you add 50 to 1897, and where do you end up? 47. He was close. It was 51 years. And everybody knows Israel's around 51 years later. Then we come to World War I, the famous Balfour Declaration. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. And this is the first time we have a government, and in matter of fact, the supreme power in the world at the time is England. They're not much anymore, are they? What happened? I'll tell you one thing I think is the reason for that is that they, from the middle 1920s to 1948, they turned their back on Israel. But that's another story for another lecture. But he says, and the government will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, that is the Arabs, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So they don't want this set up to hurt Jews elsewhere. In 1948, it did hurt Jews elsewhere. And we don't want to hurt Palestinian Arabs. Then we come to Hitler and World War II, and his answer to the final solution, the Jewish question, the final solution, the extermination of all Jewish people on planet Earth. Now, did you know that Germany is the first major green country? The Green Party, the environmental wackos, started in Germany. And it started in the 1800s, long before the Nazi Party arose. But Hitler embraced it as part of his agenda. And one of his goals was to turn Germany into a garden and move all the industrial things to the conquered lands, like Poland, Russia, and keep all the industrial revolution soot and stuff somewhere else, and make all the things that we need for our lives. But where we live, it's going to be a garden. A book, let me recommend to you, Mark Musser, M-U-S-S-E-R. Nazi Oaks was the original title. I think it's been republished under another title, but I don't remember that other title. But I read the original version. Nazi Oaks. You might search for that on Amazon and get the latest edition. It's a very hard book to read, but it's very good. But you have to study it. You can't just casually read it. 6 million Jews were killed. That's roughly the population of the entire state of Tennessee. Was murdered by the Nazis. That's how many Jewish people. And they killed the children and the women. They killed them all. There is an Arab connection to Hitler. Do you know who this guy is? Amin al-Husseini. Have you seen his name? Okay. In Germany, he was in Germany during much of World War II. He was basically somewhat of a counselor to Hitler. And they were discussing and planning the extermination of the Jews in the Middle East. He opposed in the 1920s Zionism, and he was actually appointed by the British, I think, to be head over there. He was Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, 1921. And of course, his goal as the Grand Mufti was to make sure that there were no more Jews coming into the area. And guess who the British sided with eventually? Out of fear of violence, they sided with these guys. More death, I want to just say this in passing. As many Jews may have been killed by Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union during World War II as Hitler. And it's a bit of an affront that Russians sat as judges at the Nuremberg trials in light of that. I had a professor in my college studies. He's my favorite professor, and I took several Russian history courses. And he made this statement that kind of took me aback, and I think it's right. He said Hitler at least had an ideological reason to kill the Jews. Now, he was very wicked and very wrong in that. But he had an ideological reason, crazy, wicked, evil reason. And he said that, and then he said the Russians, going back to the Tsars, they killed Jews for fun. So there was this animosity toward the Jews there in Russia that preceded the Soviet Union, and it continued into the Soviet Union. In spite of the fact that you have some Jewish people as part of the Bolshevik Revolution. I just wanted to throw that in a little bit. Now, the Arab-Israeli conflict, I'm going to call this the new anti-Semitism. The new anti-Semitism is shifting to the nation. Still there for the Jews elsewhere, but primarily focusing now on the nation. And I just put up two handsome people, Golda Meir and Yasser Arafat, two well-known historical figures as perhaps symbols of that conflict. And we're going to walk through that. In your notes, notice I just have dates. And again, just write down the thing. And my goal here is not so much for you to remember these details as if you're going to take a test. My primary goal is I want to overwhelm you by the volume of data that's there, so you feel the pressure of that. So let's go down this trail. 1947, the UN partition plan and the 1949 armistice lines. You know, the whole thing is roughly what it is now. 1948, the War of Israeli Independence. Israel declares their independence in May 1948. They accepted the 1947 partition plan. The Arabs rejected it because they don't want any Israel at all. And Israel, the day after they declared their independence, are attacked by Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. Forces were also sent by Saudi Arabia and Yemen. So you add that up, that's 7 nations attack Israel the day after they declare independence. And these forces, probably led by Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, believe that in about 2 or 3 days they would totally dismantle and destroy the Jewish people. And that did not happen. In 1956, we have the Suez Canal crisis. And it's not just the Suez Canal. I believe they also blockaded the Straits of Hormuz to prevent shipping getting to Israel. But they're blocking the Suez Canal. Egypt is trying to raise its power in the world. Great Britain, France, and Israel threatened Egypt over the nationalization of the Suez Canal. It wasn't going to be international anymore, and so countries might have to pay to use it. Things like that. Pressure, they could use political pressure. You don't give us what we want, we'll close the canal. So there was all kinds of stuff going on, and Great Britain, France, and Israel are rolling their tanks through the Sinai on the way to the canal. And guess what? The USA and the USSR step in to stop the conflict. Probably the last time we ever agreed with the USSR on anything when it was in existence. Then we have in 1967 the 6-Day War. Israel battles Egypt and Syria. And I believe Jordan is also in that. I left them off. I should have included them. And that's when Israel captures the old city. And you see the soldiers here, the famous picture of the soldiers at the Western Wall. Now you go there, and there's a big plaza. They've made it really nice. Big plaza in front of the wall. Here, there were buildings almost right up to it. There's a little alleyway. And the Arabs had no respect whatsoever for the Jewish things, and they were not going to allow a worship space to develop. So Israel battles Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. They call it a preemptive strike, but once again, Egypt had blockaded the Straits of Hormuz, which is an act of war. And so Israel, in a sense, was justified, but they did do a preemptive strike of sorts and destroyed the entire Egyptian Air Force, caught by surprise. And the war lasted for 6 days. For 6 days. And it's a great story. 1972, the Munich massacre. Most of you are old enough to remember that. Some of you aren't. 1972, I remember that. I was still a teenager, but I remember it vividly. 11 Israeli Olympic athletes murdered by 8 Palestinian terrorists from the group Black September. And the Palestinians were aided by a West German neo-Nazi group. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War. This is the 17-day war. Israel attacked by Egypt and Syria on the Day of Atonement. Jordan stays out of this one. The actual conflict lasts less than 20 days. I think it's 17 days is the actual conflict. And it looked bad for Israel initially. Of course, we look back upon that, and it's almost just part of our history. But Israel was doing badly early on. They were caught by surprise on their high holy day. And Golda Meir lost a lot of political prestige over that. and she was on the phone with President Nixon begging for supplies, military supplies. And Nixon didn't want to give it to her until he saw the reconnaissance photos of the Israelis pulling out their nuclear weapons. And so he called Golda Meir and says, "It's on the way, put your nukes away." And they turned it around 17 days. 17 days. I had a teacher in Sunday school. I had just, I was going to become a Christian, and I became a Christian in 1974. And my Sunday school teacher, my first Sunday school class I ever attended for single young adults, he was involved with some of the equipment and things, and he said that in the Yom Kippur War, the Russians sent a whole cargo of couple planes with the wrong ammunition for their tanks. And so for a couple of hours, the Egyptian tanks were sitting ducks in the Sinai. And I imagine there's some clerks in the logistics department in Russia's military that ended up in the gulag over that. But Israel turned that around. Do you think God kind of made the clerics make a mistake in that office in deciding which ammo to send? There are little things like that turn things around. 1976, the Entebbe raid. There's a picture of somebody. Do you know who that is? Anybody know who that is?
Jonathan Netanyahu.
That's Jonathan Netanyahu, Yanni, the son of Ben Zion and the brother of Benjamin, the older brother of Benjamin Netanyahu. He was the only one killed. He was the leader of the rescue operation, and he was the only one killed of the Israeli soldiers. And they rescued their hostages.
He was shot by a sniper, wasn't he?
Perhaps. I don't remember.
That's how they portrayed it in the movie. Anyway.
It must be right then.
No,
Okay.
but it could be reasonably accurate.
Yeah. Israel rescues Israeli hostages being held by terrorists at the Entebbe airport in Uganda. And there was a flight to Paris that had been hijacked and sent there. And the terrorists included Palestinians and leftist Germans. It keeps coming back to this neo-Nazi Germans. They're leftist. They're not on the right conservative, as I talked about yesterday, and doing business with the Palestinians because they share hatred for the Jewish people, hatred for Israel. In 1981, there's the bombing of the Iraqi nuclear reactor. June 7th, it's at Osirak, about 18 miles southeast of Baghdad. And the Israelis, of course, Saddam Hussein was in charge in those days. We're not yet to the Gulf War, first Gulf War, where we get involved. Okay, that's going to happen later. But the Israelis make sure that Saddam Hussein does not get nuclear weapons. And they use F-16s to bomb the site with F-15s for cover. In 1982, the first Lebanon War, the next year, we have the Operation Peace of Galilee. This is where they finally got tired of all of the rockets coming from the PLO. The PLO had all gone to Lebanon. And they were shooting Katyusha rockets into northern Israel. They would plan them for when the children were getting out of school in northern Israel. I think we mentioned that earlier. And Israel finally had enough, so we're going to stop that. They called it Operation Peace of Galilee, and just rolled their tanks up through there, and it became an ammo dump. And eventually, all the PLO were surrounded in Beirut. So, in the entire Syrian Air Force, Syria came to the aid of the PLO, and their entire Air Force was destroyed in 3 days. About 90 planes. And after this war, Israel is viewed as the bully of the Middle East. Now, I was there for that war. That's when I was an engineer working with the Israeli soldiers in the summer of 1982. And they were elated with their F-16s and their F-15s and all of that. They had switched early in the 1960s. They all had all French Mirages. France was the supplier. But after the Six-Day War, we became the main supporter and the best friend of Israel, at least most of the time. And I'm not sure we are today. What would our government do today if the cartels in Mexico started lobbing rockets into Texas? Would our federal government do anything, or would we have to send the Texas Rangers down there to take care of it? But that's, did they have a right to do that? Yes, they did. They have a right to defend themselves. And they did, and they went up there. 1987, they're called the bullies of the Middle East because now it's clear they have a powerful military. They have a powerful military. And so everything shifts. In fact, after Entebbe, there were no more hijackings of airplanes. And now there's not going to be any more frontal wars. Just armies lining up and go. Because Israel's too powerful. So they have to go to other tactics. And there's a lot of guerrilla warfare kind of things here and there. But in 1987, just to name some of them, we had the first Palestinian Intifada. That means uprising. Intifada is an uprising. It's a campaign of organized riots against Israel. We've had debates in our country over the last several months of whether things were organized riots or not. These were a campaign of organized riots against Israel, guerrilla warfare from December 1987 to September 1993. And there were several thousand people died in that. 1993, suicide bombings increase. Arabs realize they cannot defeat Israel in a military confrontation, so guerrilla warfare, terrorist intimidation continues. And the height of the bombings is 2001 to 2003. Then in 2000, we have the second Palestinian Intifada. Do you know who this fellow is? Ariel Sharon. He was the prime minister of Israel at that time, and he makes a visit up to the Temple Mount, which ignites a riot. At least I think it was planned ahead of time kind of thing. And they had gone through, anytime Israel has dignitaries go up on the Temple Mount, they always work with the Palestinian Authority people, the Temple Mount authorities, about that, since the Temple Mount is actually controlled by Arabs. I personally wish that was different, but that's the way that is. Started September 2000, 3,000 Palestinians killed, 1,000 Israelis killed. 64 foreigners killed, and it ends in 2005. 2006, we have the Second Lebanon War. It's against Hezbollah, who's Iranian-sponsored. It lasts for just a few months. Israel's not quite as successful. Hezbollah is never disarmed per the United Nations brokered ceasefire. So it's almost a wasted effort there, but they were tired again of the rockets coming in from the north. The Arab-Israeli conflict goes on and on and on. You have the 2008 Gaza war, ongoing battle with terrorists in Iran. There's the Iron Dome, which I'm glad they have. And they've actually helped us to hone our skills in these things, which I'm very helpful. Because we have helped them over the years, and they've been helping us. That's good. I wanted you to see this diagram. This is a helpful diagram. When the Arab-Israeli conflict became the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you see the red line? Okay. And this is mentions in the New York Times. The blue line refers to Arab-Israeli. The red line refers to Israeli-Palestinian. And you see in 1996, who was president of the United States in 1996? Bill Clinton. Okay, and you you have the Oslo Accords and those things. The New York Times makes a conscious decision to no longer call it the Arab-Israeli conflict, but to call it the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that treats the Palestinian people as an ethnic group, which I'm going to prove to you is not true. Okay, that'll be my next presentation. But then there are all those proposed peace plans. You know, every president of the United States seems to be under the impression that they need to have a peace plan for Israel. And have any of them ever actually worked? Yeah, to a point, a little bit. I mean, Jordan is at peace somewhat with Israel, and Egypt is. But overall, nothing with the Palestinians themselves, the Arab Palestinians, has ever worked. In fact, they were turning down a two-state solution as far back as the 1930s, before there was an Israel. Well, let's look at some of these. I don't think I have them all up here. The Camp David Accords, 1978. Who's the guy in the middle? Your favorite president? Jimmy Carter. There's Anwar Sadat, Menachem Begin. And Sadat paid for this with his life. He was assassinated. So Egypt makes peace with Israel. And Sadat goes to Israel, first Arab leader to ever go, as far as I know. Israel-Egypt Peace Treaty, 1979, the formalization of that. Then you have the 1991 Madrid Conference. The flag on the right, that's the Palestinian flag. 1993, 1995 Oslo Accords. There's Bill Clinton in the middle. Yitzhak Rabin, he lost his life over that. And there's Yasser Arafat, who, his widow, by the way, the word on the street is his widow and her daughter, his daughter, are living in Paris with $300 million in the bank. Now, where'd they get that money? All that aid that's been sent. And he siphoned off the aid for personal reasons. At least that's the narrative. The Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty, 1994. There's Bill Clinton again. This one seems to have borne the most fruit, I think, of things. Then the 2003 Roadmap for Peace, George Bush. There's Ariel Sharon, Abbas, the guy that replaced Yasser Arafat. And the 2020 Trump Peace Plan. Now, I don't know about you, but when they start talking about peace plans, I just want to cover my ears. You know, in Islam, there is the teaching that you make treaties for temporary purposes just until you gain strength to break them. There's also the belief that once territory has been Muslim and is taken over by the enemy, it has to be regained. So there is that spirit within Islam about that. Well, what does Yasser Arafat say about all these things? Let them sign what they like. False peace will not last. Let them sign what they like. It's just a piece of paper. False peace will not last. What is their goal? Their goal is the absolute extermination of the Jewish people in Israel. What does Jesus say to all of this? I will come again, and I will make all things right. Okay, we're a little bit early. Any questions? Yes, sir.
What do you take of the recent normalization agreements that it's simply, regardless of their hatred, is still there? Is there really the fear of these nations like Jordan and a short-term peace with Israel in order to fight back against Iran? Or is this just a cover for something more serious? Or
Well, here's what I hope, not what I know. Here's what I hope. I hope that those countries are becoming more and more secularized and less Islamic. That's what I hope. And if that's the case, that would explain a little bit as to why they would be willing to do that, because economics have become more important to them than their religious ideology. So that's what I'm hoping with the UAE and Qatar and those kind of places. And I don't know if I mentioned it here, recent survey of about 600,000, I think it was, if I remember the number right, of people in Iran. 40-something% now consider themselves not religious. And I certainly hope that's true. There's another statistic that Joel Rosenberg has highlighted in some of his books, one of his books. There are about 6 million Islamic people in the Middle East who convert to evangelical Christianity every year. Now, that's a drop in the bucket compared to the whole population, but still, 6 million, that started with 9/11. His statistics go back to 9/11, that year, 2001. And so you have 6 million every year, you start adding that up. That's a significant number of people. And if that's still ongoing, that's a major problem. And the imams, the religious leaders, are paying attention to that, and it scares them. And so I think there's some good things happening, and it might be good that maybe God is going to deal with Islam in a different way. Now, some of us don't want that. We want Islam to continue to be this mean thing floating around the Middle East to help us with our prophecies. God can fulfill things in different ways, but that's, looks like the Muslim threat is poised to be the threat, but God might do it another way. It may be a purely secular threat by the time it's all said and done. Who knows? That's God's working. Okay, any other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Well, is that perhaps part of the reason why they were willing to accept the Abraham Accord?
That they're more secular, you mean, or less detailed religious side? I think so.
No.
That's my guess, my educated guess. Anything else? Happy campers. Okay, well, let's take a break and get a little extra 5 minutes on this.